Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Kean Gardner, a foremost resident of this institution, the Parliament of New South Wales, having served in the Legislative Council here. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. It's my great pleasure to, on behalf of the Blueprint Institute team, to welcome all of you to our first in-person event, the launch of our energy initiative, Powering the Next Boom. I want to acknowledge the presence of a number of parliamentarians, we have here Councillor Kean, the member for North Sydney, the Honourable Don Harvey, the New South Wales Special Minister of State, Minister for Public Service and Employee Relations, Aboriginal Affairs and the Arts, Leader of Government University Council, my national friend, the Honourable Ben Franklin, who is the Parliamentary Secretary for Energy. And we also have joining us by Zoom shortly, the New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment, Honourable Kean, who is also, of course, one of our panellists today, and Matt has already endorsed our Powering the Next Boom paper, so we can make sure. We also have with us some former parliamentarians, so a special welcome to the Honourable Robert Hill, Michael Podgers, and Bruce Beard. I want to welcome our panellists. Joining Matt Kean, we have the CEO of Investor Group on Climate Change, Graeme Cuthbert, a partner at EY Port Jackson Partners, and our Chief Economist, Dr. Steve Hamilton. I want to acknowledge the phenomenal effort that's been devoted to producing Powering the Next Boom by its co-authors. Blueprint's CEO and co-founder, Harry Guinness, our Chief Economist, Dr. Hamilton, our Senior Researcher, Daniel Dotman, and Blueprint researchers, Josh Steinert and Luke Heaney. Blueprint's co-chairs, Ian Hancock and Giselle Kapterian, and all of the board members are proud of your work and very grateful for the whole team's efforts in the brief period since Blueprint started up. Why be involved in Blueprint? Well, there are lots of reasons. It's fun for a start. But for me, part of the story is that many generations of my family have lived and worked on the land, and I feel their toil and heritage in my blood and bones. One day years ago, it was when I still had a BlackBerry, and I was bored with the ebb and flow of question time. It does happen. I accidentally came across a YouTube video of a speech that was delivered to the packed United Nations General Assembly. I'd never seen anything about that speech before. It was riveting. It was also very long. It was the speech delivered by Margaret Thatcher 31 years ago. The Prime Minister started by saying that since she last addressed the General Assembly, which was 4 years before, one challenge, quote, has grown clearer than any other in both urgency and importance. I refer, she said, to the threat to our global environment. I shall take the opportunity of addressing the General Assembly, a captive audience, on that issue alone, unquote. And so she did. And to this day, it's a remarkable address. I then decided to pay more attention. In May of this year, I was speaking at this lectern at the New South Wales Country Mayors Conference. I stayed to listen to the next speaker, Rob Rogers, now the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Commissioner. He didn't muck around. He said that the 2019-20 bushfires that affected so many communities along the east coast, including where I live on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, quote, despite what some may say, those fires were unprecedented, unquote. Generations of my family have been witness to and affected by practically all of the great bushfires that have raged across the southeast of South Australia and the Western District of Victoria, for example, since the first colonial settlers took up their occupations on those lands a shepherd, overseers, squatters, pastoralists, farmers and graziers in the century before last. They include the Black Friday fires in 1939 and Ash Wednesday in the 20th century. At the Kalangadoo Public School, near the South Australia-Victoria border, there's a little memorial to the children of my mother's cousin, who, with their mother, perished in the Ash Wednesday fires, as did others locally on that day. Their father was injured protecting the pastoral lands on which they lived. He never really recovered. But the bushfires of 2019-20 were unprecedented. So what to do? There are many ways in which responsible citizens can engage, and for me, it's a great privilege to be associated with Blueprint, a fantastic team of thinkers, researchers, hard workers who want to fill a gap on the centre-right of Australian politics, to not leave the hard yards of policy thinking to the left or the hard right. Blueprint's values are values that are so comfortable to be aligned with, and the guiding principles for our work are hard not to embrace. And they're printed at the beginning of Powering the Next Boom. So welcome to all of you, and stay tuned while we lead in today's Zoom session with our panel, moderated by our Blueprint CEO, Harry Guinness.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It was wonderful to have you open today's proceedings, and really it's been wonderful to have you involved with Blueprint since day one. Not only are you a wealth of experience, but you're a constant reminder to us that Blueprint stands for issues that are important in the city, but also in the country. So thank you for that. Really, I think Jenny has said it all. She's described why Blueprint exists. She's described the areas in which we want to focus. And really, it's the values that I want you to be aware of in this paper. Powering the Next Boom, Priorities for Energy Reform in the coming decade. It is an accurate representation of where Australia is in the world and where we are in meeting our climate targets, but it's also an expression of Blueprint's values. And I think three stand out most profoundly. The first is a warmness and the appreciation that the decarbonisation of the economy will have effects on the most vulnerable and indeed people in regional Australia. The second is a green value, and that is of conservation for this country and the environment. And thirdly, it's in economic rigour, and it's in a deep analysis, and it's in, we think, one of the best distillations of the issues. So thank you for coming today. I'd like to throw to a video which captures the key themes in the paper. So this is featured on our website. We launched it earlier in the week, and it's a great introduction to what we've outlined in the policy work.
In the 20th century, Australia established itself as an energy powerhouse. This became vital to the health of our economy and our identity as a nation. Our energy industries create high-paying jobs, particularly in regional Australia, and keep our economy secure. But our global position is at risk. As the overseas market's appetite for renewables increases, this threatens demand for Australia's coal and natural gas. And COVID-19 seems to be accelerating this, with many nations making record investments in clean energy and technologies such as hydrogen. However, Australia is in a strong position to capitalise on these changes. Our land abounds in the best natural renewable energy resources in the world, as well as the minerals needed for producing clean tech. Governments must work with businesses to lay the foundations for the next phase in our energy industry. This can lead to unprecedented job and wealth creation through clean energy and technology. There are 4 key areas in which we can act now. 1. Transmission. Public financing of national transmission infrastructure to unlock renewable energy zones will see cheap, reliable and clean power for families and businesses. 2. Hydrogen. The economic potential for hydrogen in Australia is exceptionally strong. Using renewable energy to produce it will keep us cost competitive, and exports could be worth more than $26 billion per year for our country. 3. Clean tech finance. Other nations are investing heavily in R&D as part of their COVID stimulus. We can increase our own commitments to fund clean tech research and support Aussie companies bringing cutting-edge products to market, creating jobs and trade opportunities. 4. Minerals and batteries. Australia enjoys the best mineral resources in the world. This includes the ingredients for clean technologies. Our lithium exports are worth over $200 billion per year, but we only capture 0.5% of their value. Instead, we can process minerals onshore, even produce batteries in Australia. This would improve our energy security. As we harness the best of private sector innovations and Australian ingenuity, we will unlock lower power prices, export clean technologies, and create high-paying jobs. With effective regulation and targeted support, Australia can protect and maintain its status as a global energy superpower well into the future.
Okay, so there you have it. That's the overview. I'd now like to invite our Chief Economist, Professor Stephen Hamilton, who's usually based in the Gold Coast, but has the Sunshine Coast, but is now subject to border closures, so we're hoping to keep him here indefinitely. Stephen Hamilton.
Delighted to be here, and how phenomenal was that video? I mean, I want to start by saying how proud I am to be a part of Blueprint. For my entire life, I've wanted to have a voice in this space in Australia, and I'm so glad that there finally is one. And this document, I think, reflects so much that we are proud of as part of the Blueprint Institute. So I just want to talk today a little bit about the report, right? The kind of work we've done, and the kind of contribution we want to have to the debate in this area, right? So the hardest thing to do in public policy, and there's plenty of policymakers in the room today, is to make invisible costs visible. It's the hardest thing. And when you look at the policy landscape that we have in Australia, you can see the fingerprints of that challenge everywhere, right? And nowhere is that more stark than in climate change. We are paying, as a globe, the price for carbon today. And it is a very heavy price. And the policy challenge that we've had for the last 2 decades is forcing everyone in the world to front up to that price, right? And we haven't done a great job in Australia, right? We've been trying to make these implicit costs explicit, and it hasn't been. And we haven't made the progress we need to make, right? Now, earlier this year, in fact, 1 year ago today, we all got an extremely explicit reminder of the costs of climate change, right? We looked and we watched our country burn, right? And we know if we look at the science, we know without a doubt, events like that will become more frequent and more extreme if we don't front up to this challenge, right? Sorry, it makes me a bit emotional. So the thing is, give me a second. You know, when that happened earlier this year, I looked and I thought, finally, this is the moment. Finally, someone is going to stand up and do something about this problem, okay? And it looked for a moment like the mood would change, right? And that finally we would do something about it. And then along came COVID-19, okay? And it took our attention away. And I thought, damn it, right? We can't afford another 5 or 10 years to be distracted by this pandemic, right? We need to act. We need to do something. But looking at the world's response, I needn't have worried, okay? You look at France, 1/3 of their stimulus is on green measures. That, world leaders, in all countries have seized this moment as an opportunity to take a stand on the long-term challenges we face, right? 1 month ago, China committed to net zero by 2060, the world's largest emitter. Just this week, South Korea and Japan, 2 of Australia's 3 largest export markets, committed to net zero by 2050. Joe Biden may very well win the US election on Tuesday, And then America will go net zero by 2050. And they've committed to more than 2 trillion on climate initiatives, okay? Every state and territory government in this country has committed to net zero by 2050, okay? The world is changing and Australia cannot be left behind. That is a very important theme of this paper, right? And if we don't act, we risk that happening, okay? Now the question becomes, what have we done so far? And what can we do about it, right? And so the next half of this paper takes that sort of, you know, somber framing and turns it to positive that you can see in that video today, okay? So what about action so far? Have a look at this slide. This slide charts on the x-axis the percent emissions reduction per person since 2000 to today, right, by country. Each one of these dots represents an OECD country. The y-axis is our level of emissions in the year 2000. So the level of emissions in the year 2000 was where we started the race, and the x-axis tells us how far we've come. Which is the bad corner? It's top left. The bad corner is the top left. They're the people who started at the last position in the race and have made the least progress. Which dot do you think Australia is? No one cooked these numbers. This is every OECD country plotted on a graph from 2000 to 2019. That's Australia. Okay? We started the race at the end and we've made the least progress. If you add up per capita emissions in all of these countries between 2000 and 2019, Australia is the worst, Australians, every person in this room has emitted more carbon dioxide than any other nation on earth except Luxembourg, which has 600,000 people, okay? So this paper frames, it sticks to the facts and it frames the lack of progress and the grave challenge we face in the future. So I hope you read it. So what are we going to do about it, right? We're policymakers. Our job is to solve problems like this. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to recognize that the transition isn't doom and gloom. Actually, it presents Australia with incredible opportunities, right? It turns out Australia has abundant renewable resources that in fact place us very well to capitalize on the opportunities presented by the transition, right? So instead of sticking our heads in the sand and seeing it as a threat, we should seize the opportunity and position us strategically to capitalize on those opportunities, right? And so in this paper, we set out a course for the country to do that. So first we lay out the next 10 years, right? So we propose that Australia commits to net zero by 2050, as almost everyone is doing. But to get to net zero by 2050, we need to start today. We're currently projected to have emissions fall by only 4.5% between now and 2030, right? So, you know, there's a graph in this paper that shows a very minimal degree of action over the next decade. If we want to hit net zero, we've got to start today, right? Turns out, to hit our Paris target, the arithmetic is very clear. It's simple and clear. To hit our Paris target without using our carryover credits, we need to reduce emissions by 15% over the next 10 years. That's it, 15%. Okay? How do we do that? To reduce our emissions by 15%, we need to halve our emissions from electricity. Electricity is the low-hanging fruit of emissions reduction. So that's where we should start, okay? Halve our emissions from electricity in the next 10 years and we hit our Paris targets, okay? How do you do that? That's where it gets tricky, okay? There is no way to decarbonize our electricity sector without shutting down coal-fired power plants. There's no other way. That's where the emissions come from. So this transition will involve a bring forward of decommissioning of coal-fired power plants from the 2030s to the 2020s. The current 6 plants due to go offline in the 2030s, they need to go offline in the next 10 years, right? If we do that, we hit our Paris targets and we get ourselves on a way to net zero, right? Now, what are the barriers to doing that? Well, there are 3 barriers. One is transmission. So we have a detailed discussion of transmission in the paper. that talks about the barriers to transmission infrastructure investment, which surround mainly regulation, right? To get the cables to connect the renewables that we need to replace coal. That's number one. Number two is this renewable resource, energy, it can be unreliable, right? So it presents a reliability challenge. So we need to front up to that too, right? And the third thing, which is really important, and I really do urge you to read the content on this in the paper, but those coal plants are the hearts of their local communities, right? And if those closures are going to be brought forward, whether it be by government action or inevitability, the government has to put in a plan today to support those communities through the transition, right? We have to front up to the challenge and we have to help them, right? So we talk a little bit about that in the paper. Now, looking further forward, suppose we look at that 10-year transition and we make it, then we have to start asking tougher questions, right? Where can the emissions reductions come from beyond the next 10 years? Because the electricity sector is only a third of our emissions, right? And so then the paper goes through a number of future opportunities, right, that the Australian economy can benefit from in driving that further transition. So one area in particular that we highlight in the paper is green hydrogen, right? And I mean, a lot of people in the room have a lot of experience in renewables, and I think would know that the exciting kind of prospects for that industry. And given Australia's cheap, abundant renewable resources, I think that's an area we can really capitalize on and create an industry to replace the sort of fossil fuel sector, which is sure to decline over the next few decades. We also talk about a few other interesting prospects like soil carbon, right? The electric vehicle transition. And so in the paper, we're laying out kind of a few interesting ideas that we're planning on making a part of our research agenda in the years ahead. So I urge you to read the paper. It's absolutely gorgeous, right? It's a beautiful document. And having it in a hard copy, it's just so gratifying, right? I can't wait to show my mum. I urge you all to read it. I do honestly think I've been in public policy more than a decade, and I can say this is one of the most substantive pieces of policy research that I've seen. So I urge you to read it. And please get in touch with us if you have something to say, right? If there's something in here that you think misses the mark, or if you have some additional ideas that you think we could use. We're launching today a research initiative, right, to write more and more of these papers in this area to try and drive progress in this space. So thanks very much for that. And are you going to come up, Harry? Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Stephen. If anybody didn't pick up on the fact that this is something that we care passionately about, I'd just like to reiterate that. And we certainly do welcome you reaching out to us. Now it's my pleasure to announce our guest of honour today, Minister Matt Kean. He's New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment, who I'm sure needs no introduction. Minister, great to have you. Thank you for joining us. Have we got you on audio?
Hi, Harry. Hi.
Great. Good to see you, and thank you for joining us today. Minister, your advocacy on energy and the environment and rational economic policy is one of the shining lights of conservative and liberal politics in this country. You have said that you can't think of anything that is more in line with the Liberal Party than supporting the free market to deliver the outcomes that are best for consumers. And you've said that you want New South Wales to be the Saudi Arabia of solar energy. Great to have you. How can we inspire greater ambition on climate action? And what are the big opportunities that can help drive Australia to net zero 2050?
Well, Harry, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to launch this impressive paper. And can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and just remind everyone that the land we're meeting on is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Look, Harry, as I said, I'm so honoured to be here to launch the Blueprint Institute's Energy Initiative. The motto of the Institute is that every great vision starts with a blueprint. Great visions come from great leaders, and the board, strategic council and staff of the Blueprint Institute are a roll call of great leaders drawn from the state and federal spheres. They share a commitment to reform in the progressive tradition which has done so much to build modern Australia. The challenges our country faces are enormous, as Stephen highlighted. Some are literally novel in the case of COVID-19. Others, like climate change, are challenges that have taken a long time to comprehend, but whose consequences are gathering speed. My absolute conviction is that the principles that have guided the great reforms of the past will deliver the reforms that we need to tackle these challenges today. Great reforms are born from harvesting the power of markets, the ingenuity of business, and embracing technological advances. The strength of this paper and the wisdom of the Institute comes from applying these principles to come up with practical, achievable solutions. One of the significant insights in this discussion paper is that decarbonisation of the electricity system is the right place to start. So that's vindication of the approach that we've taken right here in New South Wales. Electricity is the right place to start the journey to net zero because thermal generators are retiring, because renewable energy is cheap, and because that is where the most carbon emissions can be avoided. As the discussion paper notes, our renewable energy resources are abundant, and they are located in places where our transmission infrastructure is not. So significant investment is needed to align the two. I'm pleased to say that we're working well with the Commonwealth Government to get that infrastructure built as soon as possible. The Blueprint paper aligns with the recently released New South Wales Decarbonisation Innovation Study by our state's chief scientist, which identified 65 economic opportunities across the key sectors of the state's economy, including services, energy, industry, and the built environment, land management, and transport. As we face the fallout from an unprecedented pandemic, the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, is to get our economy moving again by building a more sustainable future. And in doing so, harvest these opportunities to generate new industries and new jobs. Australians are fundamentally forward-looking people whose instinct is to lead rather than to follow. So it doesn't sit well with us to act as spectators on the greatest technological transformation of our time. And it is disastrous for our economy if we continue to do so. There is vindication in this blueprint for New South Wales, but there are challenges as well, and opportunities, if we grasp them to build a more sustainable and more prosperous economy. This is an important contribution to a new institute that seems destined to lead some of the most important policy debates for our future. Can I congratulate you, Harry, and the entire team at the Institute, and encourage everyone interested in energy transformation and climate change to read this paper and support the excellent work of the Blueprint Institute. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you so much for the kind words. We very much appreciate you being with us today, and you've agreed to stay for a couple of questions from the audience. So if I may turn to the audience in person first, would anyone like to pose a question to the Minister? Righto. In which case, John Connor.
Minister John Connor from the Carbon Market Institute. It's unused to being in a public event, so we're getting some feedback here. So look, thank you for your commitment and thank you for the Blueprint Institute. I think it's great to see a commitment international as well as domestic, and so and great to see the commitment on electricity as well. So, but I'm also interested in your broader work in the farming sector, and so how we help to deliver benefits across regional New South Wales and regional Australia with some of the other activities that are highlighted here, soil carbon and other things as well.
Yeah, look, thanks, John. I think the point needs to be made that we're not going to get to net zero by decarbonising the electricity system alone. There's going to be a range of measures that need to be implemented right across our entire economy. My view is that where we've got technologies available, where we can decarbonise and reduce cost of living pressures to families and businesses in our state and in our country, we should roll out those technologies at scale. Where those technologies don't exist, we really need to invest heavily in R&D. to make sure that we can address those hard to abate emissions in some sectors of the economy. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. That's the big challenge that we face. And that's why we've seen a lack of action governments come and go in trying to solve this. No one's been able to crack the nut in how we decarbonise, but do it in a way that doesn't destroy jobs, doesn't decrease our living standards, and sets us up for success in the future. We don't have all the answers yet, but we need to invest in research. We need to encourage the entrepreneurial and innovative spirit of our best minds in this country. That's the only way we can crack this nut, not only for our benefit here, but we know that 70% of the world's GDP, or 50% of the world's GDP today, has signed up to hit net zero emissions. So they're going to need to solve this problem. 70% of our trading partners have signed up to hit net zero emissions. So they're going to need to crack this nut as well. We're really well placed to help them do that. And in doing so, set ourselves up to be an economic superpower in a low carbon global economy.
Absolutely, here. I think we have one more question from the middle.
Hi, Minister. Nikki Ison from WWF Australia. You just talked about the role of R&D and scaling up existing solutions. Those are both areas where Australia has played an excellent role. One of the areas where we seem to be less good at is creating early market demand for new technology, clean and zero emission technologies. Do you see a role for Liberal parties, yourself, the New South Wales one included, in helping to stimulate that market demand?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical. As Stephen said earlier, there's this huge opportunity for Australia in the hydrogen space. We know a lot of economies that have targeted net zero emissions. They know how to do that when it comes to delivering electrons, but no one has worked out how we're going to do it when it comes to molecules. How do we replace diesel and gas and petrol? And that's where hydrogen comes in. We know South Korea have said that they're going to need hydrogen to get to net zero. We know Japan said that they're going to need hydrogen to get to net zero. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So there's these huge markets emerging, and we're really well placed to do it. In order to create, get that industry going, we need to create that demand right here in Australia. The one way to do that is what we're doing currently with the gas network. We're aiming to have 10% of our entire gas network able to take hydrogen. That will catalyse the development of hydrogen. We're looking to mandate that. Take, for example, our buses. We're going to electrify our bus fleet in Sydney, but we're looking to update and modernise our fleet in the regions by making them hydrogen buses. That will again catalyse the demand and the development of the industry. So those hydrogen markets and opportunities will really come on fast in the 2030s. So we need to make sure that we're ready to take those opportunities when they come. And that means creating local domestic opportunities to grow the industry here and be able to scale it up. So yes, creating demand, whether it be in hydrogen, whether it be in green steel, whether it be in ammonia, is going to be a really important thing to do. We're focused on that. It's part of our net zero strategy, which I've released to the market here in New South Wales. And I'm not doing this because I'm a climate alarmist. I'm not doing this because I'm a mad greenie. I'm doing this because I'm economically rational. And I care about ensuring that we leave our economy stronger than we found it. We set ourselves up to be not only an energy superpower, but an economic superpower.
Thank you very much, Minister. We're going to move on to our panel discussion, but I'd just like to thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your advocacy and your work and the leadership of yourself and the New South Wales Government. Okay, fantastic. I'd now like to invite to the stage our three panellists for today. Stephen, if you'd like to join us again. Secondly, Emma Hurd, who's been the CEO of the Investor Group on Climate Change since August 2015. The group represents total funds under management of $2.5 trillion and a membership of 7.5 million people in Australia and New Zealand. Emma has worked in climate change, sustainability, public policy and finance for almost 20 years. And thirdly, Graeme Cuthbert, who's a partner at Port Jackson Partners, having previously worked in BCG in London and in Australia, and as a senior executive in the UK and New South Wales governments. His primary interest is in the intersection between government policy and commercial incentives, which I think couldn't be any more timely and topical for today's discussion. So thank you all for joining us. Emma, I might start with you. The Investor Group on Climate Change recently conducted modelling suggesting that if current climate targets and policy approaches are continued in the coming decades, then significant private investments would be lost. Can you describe to us what quantum we're talking about here and why exactly that might be the case?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. And thanks very much for inviting me to join. I feel quite honoured, the inaugural mostly in-person event of the Blueprint Institute. And congrats on the paper that's been released today. It's a really thoughtful, considered and really well articulated argument for the importance of energy in decarbonisation as well. So our members, for those of you unfamiliar with our work, our members are large institutional investors focused on the financial implications of climate change. We've been around for about 15 years, and in that time we've seen this seismic shift in the way that the financial community is thinking about climate change as a financial and an economic risk. And they're looking at it from the context of, I guess you could say, three perspectives. They're looking at it in the context of climate as a macroeconomic risk. So what will it do to the investment environment into which you are looking to manage capital? And a lot of that work's actually being driven by financial regulators in terms of thinking through the systemic risks of climate change for national economies and for global industry, for the global economy as well. Secondly, they're looking at it from the perspective of investment risk. So how do they begin to analyse and quantify the kinds of financial implications that you will see from major decarbonisation trends across industry sectors, and also the structural shifts in terms of opportunity and in terms of demand flows and in terms of trade flows that will come when we see the application of new technology or the fall in demand for carbon intensive products and services as well. And in particular, if you remember that institutional investors are long-term investors, they build, they buy, they own things for a long time. They look to give us back our retirement savings after roughly 35 to 40 years. They look long-term at these issues, but they're investing over much shorter timeframes as well. So the risk is a really key significant issue for investors that they're trying to manage. And then thirdly, there's the opportunity. And I think one of the interesting things about this paper is that it lays out, I was going to say in black and white, but maybe blue and grey would be more accurate. It lays out the fact that, you know, Australia in this global sectoral, this global kind of structural change that we're going to see this century is once again the lucky country in that we have the resources to power a whole new form of economic development. We have the skills and capabilities. We're very good at adapting, at doing the research, at thinking through the solutions. And unfortunately, we're also exceptionally good at thinking through the physical effects of climate change because we also already have a very volatile and extreme environment. So we're also very good at the skills, the intellectual approaches to managing for a more volatile environment as well. So in that sense, to the specific piece of research that we did, we looked to put a dollar figure on that. Because if there's one thing the finance community likes, it's a big fat dollar figure. And what we found that there are, you know, in 5, 10, 30 years, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of potential investment opportunity of deep decarbonisation within Australia. And there's also hundreds of billions of dollars of lost opportunity if we don't decarbonise. And that's before you even factor in the actual costs of climate change. And on a day where not just is Blueprint releasing its first paper, but also the Royal Commission into Bushfires came out, I think you begin to see how Australia is really well positioned to scale up our response to these issues and deploy that expertise, you know, look at those solutions and those opportunities available to us and actually, you know, benefit from decarbonisation and dealing with climate change in a major way as well. So I don't think that the finance sector is getting into climate change because they enjoy it. Particularly this week, I would say that there's certain members of the finance sector that haven't had a great week in terms of talking about climate change, but they're doing it because there's money on the table to be won and lost if we get this wrong or if we get this right. And if they can't find the opportunity in Australia, they'll take their capital offshore and they'll find that opportunity there as well.
Graeme, let me bring you in. You worked in the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change 10 years ago during which time they laid the groundwork for their new fleet of wind power and progressively phased out coal. In our report, in the Blueprint report, we captured what they achieved in this time. The UK reduced electricity emissions by 54.7% in the space of 10 years. It was a remarkable achievement. What are your lessons learned from the UK and how do they apply in the Australian context?
Thanks, Harry. And can I echo everyone else's congratulations on the publication of that paper? I think a really important contribution in two dimensions. Firstly, it's cogent and well argued and very sensible. And secondly, I think it represents a really important voice that may not have been missing, but has been too quiet over the last few years in Australia. And to your question, to be perfectly honest, I'm a little bit surprised and rather embarrassed to be answering it. When we sat in the UK 10 years ago, one of the things that we would do would be to look at Australia and a few other countries and say, geez, this would be a hell of a lot easier if we had the resources and the capacity that Australia had to decarbonise the economy instead of what the UK had available. But that's water under the bridge, I suppose. Four things that I think we found out very quickly in the UK experience that I think are relevant to Australia, and some of them have been touched on or picked up already here. The first is the importance of targets and trajectories. There's no way that the UK would have done what they did without having, at the time, an 80% emissions reductions target for 2050. And then my job was to work back from that and think about the practical paths that got you there. And that told you very quickly, you had to decarbonise essentially the entire UK electricity sector by 2030, and then in fact build another one so that you could decarbonise heat and transport over there. And you simply couldn't do that with onshore wind. There just wasn't enough space. It's a pretty small country. There wasn't community acceptance, and that pushed you to offshore wind very quickly. And so it was only because they had those targets and that trajectory that they realised the near-term practical implications that they then had to deal with in order to be on that path. The second is the importance of markets. And you can talk about this in all sectors, but the electricity sector is a really good example. UK electricity markets, Australian electricity markets were essentially designed to sweat assets built by government-owned utilities. And they do that very, very effectively. What they don't do is to take large strategic bets on short-run marginal cost of zero plant and the transmission that's needed to build them. The lesson from the UK is that you don't throw out competitive markets and go back to the state-owned utility model. Perhaps you could, but it's not necessarily a great idea. You can get there by tweaking those markets and adapting them. So the UK did things like they put a floor on the EU carbon price to send a very clear investment signal and quite a certain investment signal to the financial community. We put a capacity market in to show the value of firm capacity, and we allowed demand side to participate in that market as well. And if anything, I'd say that the UK electricity markets work better now than they did 10 years ago before we started on that journey. The third lesson, I think, is transmission related, which is that you basically need government action to plan and trigger really large scale natural monopoly investments like transmission. You need someone sitting in the centre saying, we know roughly the direction we're heading, and we're going to make judgments about where we need really big, socially backed investment in infrastructure like transmission lines. You can then design competitive processes like auctions, and the UK did that. Their transmission is built through auction-based processes, but it starts with a top-down view of what the future system needs to look like, and therefore what assets need to be built to support that. And then the third one really is to echo your point, Emma, which is the commercial drivers for this for Britain were at least as real as the environmental ones. They were part of the EU and still are, at least at the moment, at the time, but they saw their critical trading partners with a very clear expectation that over the next decades, in order to participate in the in global markets effectively, they were going to be participating in a decarbonised global market. And the political positioning of that was all about the jobs of construction and maintaining the assets. But behind the scenes, they were really worried about the positioning of London as a global financial centre, the ability of their manufacturing sector and their engineering sector to participate in global supply chains. And they were very conscious that they needed to, if not be ahead of that curve, certainly be at the forefront of that curve if they were worried about their long-term competitiveness. And I think that has lessons for Australia in two dimensions. Firstly is the positive one. There is opportunity. I think everyone sees that. And the second is the negative, which is that it's hard to imagine a world in 20 years' time in which all of our trading partners have made these decisions and made these investments. And if we're lagging, that we're not going to be penalised on that. So that's the fourth thing I'd say. That commercial driver was really real for them 10 years ago. And I think Australia's catching up to that.
Yeah, thank you. And what I find remarkable about the UK example is that the Conservatives in the UK, the Conservative government, are 10 points ahead of Labor in the public's perception of their abilities to steward the environment. So it's quite a remarkable achievement that's been achieved on the right side of politics in that nation. We might go to two questions from the Zoom call. The first from Thomas Cochrane, and I'll pose both to the panel. You can answer whichever you prefer or both. How do we address the political partisanship that has prevented action so far? And the second question from Michael Smith, should we speed up the process of transformation with a levy on fossil fuels? So Emma, would you like to start?
Thanks for that. Look, I would say that a competition of ideas on solutions is incredibly healthy. A competition on facts is not. This is a difficult enough challenge for Australia's future economic health anyway. And I think it's played out in a particularly challenging decade for Australian policy and politics. So we've had it's a bit of a double header in that regard. I also think it's not that surprising that this is such a difficult issue for Australia because it's fundamental to our economy. So of course it was always going to be hard and it was always going to be hard fought in that regard. But I think we're certainly at the point where we definitely need to have a narrowing of the field of that competition of ideas, and we need some consensus on major pathways forward for key industries, and we need policymakers and the private sector to actually come closer together again on this issue in terms of coming up with solutions. I don't think anyone's arguing that we're ever going to have bipartisan policy in this. I think that would be a little unhealthy, to be honest, but I think we actually need a narrowing of the field in terms of the contested nature of the ideas.
So you said bipartisanship is not achievable and not wanted?
Well, it's definitely wanted.
But unlikely.
Less hyperpartisan, I think, would be a healthy first step. Yep. And certainly, I think there are areas of future economic growth where we can agree that this is where we need to go. Like, there are some things like transmission infrastructure and upgrading the grid, which I think there's not that contested. You know, I think the people have spoken in terms of having the highest installation rate of solar panels per household. That's not contested. I think in the response to the bushfires at the beginning of the year, you know, we saw that coming together that you spoke so eloquently about in terms of recognising the need to tackle our response to disasters and to increase the resilience of our communities and our economies. I think that's less contested. I think we're making progress, which is good. but I certainly think that, you know, we need to recognise that there's always going to be an argument, a contest of ideas, but we don't have to have perhaps we don't have to have it as hyperpartisan as it's been for the last few years.
Certainly agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think a theme in our report, and it couldn't have been more clearly put in place this week, right, with the net zero pledges by a number of countries, is a sense of inevitability. So the transition isn't something we need to choose to do. The transition is going to happen. The world is moving, right? Energy is becoming less carbon intensive. The question is, do we want to do it on our terms or do we want to have it forced on us, right? And so that has to be, I think, the political angle. This is coming. This change is coming. These coal plants, for example, are not going to be running in 50 years. They have an expiry date. The question is, do we want to stand up to it make the decision to make the transition on our terms in a way that favors us and support the transition, right? Support the community on the way through. And I think, I hope, you know, Harry, you tweeted, you said about Japan's net zero, it was a domino, and Korea came 2 days later. And that was 1 month after China, right? There is an inevitability about this transition. So the other thing to mention is, you know, there are 6 coal plants in Queensland, my home state, right? It's a very important industry to my home state. And tens of thousands of people have their livelihoods tied up in that mineral, right? So any government who wants to do anything, any political party, you can't have a net zero pledge if you don't have a plan, right? You can't have a 2030 target if you don't have a plan, right? You have to front up to that challenge of supporting community transition, right? And without it, those electorates aren't going to vote for it. So, thank you. Graeme.
This might be a controversial view in this particular location, but I'm increasingly not bothered by the politics of it, because I think it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. It's that inevitability point that you make. And I think the commercials are going to drive action really quickly in at least 3 ways. Firstly, lots of our clients are thinking about this as a commercial issue much more than they are thinking about it as an environmental one or a policy issue. Second, we're a small open economy and we're essentially a price taker on lots of things. Our vehicle choice is not driven by Australian government politics. It's driven by emission standards in California. And thirdly, once you have border adjustments coming in, which I think you said earlier, Stephen, that people are talking about them already and not that far from implementing them, it almost doesn't matter what our local settings are, because we're going to be forced to adapt to what our trading partners demand. And so I think it'd be much better if we were leading that, but we're going to get dragged along with it one way or another, and I think our politics will eventually catch up. On the second question, I feel like we should deal with the second question as well. Look, I'd love to see a levy on fossil fuels. Ideally, we do it in a way that looks like a broad-based carbon tax would be the best way to do it.
I can't not respond to that.
I can't not respond. We'll be here all day.
You won't find an economist worth their salt who won't support a price on carbon. So in this document, we have an entire page devoted to the question. Electricity, it would be good, but there are other ways to deal with that, because there are so few sources of fossil fuels. The task is so clear. I mean, literally, there are those 6 plants, and then we need renewables to replace them, right? But driving decarbonisation across thousands of businesses, right, and different industries in places like agriculture, that's a very complex transition. Like from getting from sort of 15% to 100% is a huge task. And frankly, that's the sort of thing where I find it very difficult to imagine making the transition without like broad incentives to drive that decarbonisation. So, I mean, I don't know, the politics of carbon pricing has been pretty fraught. But, you know, there's no doubt, again, there's unanimity among economists that it's the way to go.
Can I just add one final point to that, is that actually we do have a carbon price in Australia. Yeah. We have a secondary market which is trading in a very bilateral way. We have a growing carbon producing market, and it's actually a key area of both investment opportunity and skills and expertise differentiation for Australia's position globally, not just in soil carbon, but in a whole range of activities. Certainly when we did our analysis around future investment opportunities for transition, sequestration was the biggest commercial opportunity for Australia in the next 5 years, 10 years. So in that sense, the second way we also have a carbon price, I might add, is that investors are already engaging with companies and looking at their carbon price assumptions. So we have one, but it's opaque. We don't have transparency around it. It's contested, and it's not serving our community interests or our future economic interests in an efficient way, which is why it's not just the economists that argue for it, but actually increasingly many companies who were once arguing very hard against it are now arguing for it as well. Or in the case of some companies like Shell, the very first global acquisition they made of a carbon project development company was an Australian carbon project development company as part of their global nature-based solutions strategy. So, yeah, this is another significant area of opportunity, which if we step away from the politics of the last 10 years, we can actually look at it from a commercial lens and see that it's a key area of core skills and expertise for us.
Fantastic. We've also talked about the inevitability of net zero 2050 and the implications on fossil fuel communities and the industry. How should we think about the skills transition? This is from Carolyn Joyce, by the way, on Zoom. Obviously, we'll have particular regions adversely affected. How do we manage that?
Yeah, so there's a fascinating report by the UTS put out, I think it was last year, that looked at mapping out whole areas of Australia, looking at the location of coal plants and looking at potential areas of renewable energy zones and trying to find, is there some complementarity here? Like, could we put large scale renewable energy projects in places in close proximity to shut down coal? And they said there is some prospect for that, right? So, and there's a huge degree of job creation in renewables in the construction phase. It's massive. It's going to generate thousands of jobs, right? And we're going to need those jobs right across regional areas. So the one challenge you have, the two challenges, one, some of those jobs aren't perfectly substitutable, right? You can't take a skilled mining engineer and get them to install a solar farm, right? So there's going to be some job displacement that we're going to have to try and support. And the other challenge on the jobs is there's a significant jobs boom in the construction phase, but renewable energy, one of the reasons why things like solar are so cheap is because they have very low maintenance costs. So the job creation in the longer term is less, right? So I think there's going to be a transitional phase where we try and help the displaced workers, and we have to think of and Blueprint's going to put in a lot of effort into trying to think of ways to solve this problem. But then I think this is where we launch into these sort of other industries that the renewable energy sector can generate, like hydrogen and other things, right, that could build those jobs further down the line.
I think there are two versions of this. One's the micro version and one's the macro. And the micro version is, as you say in your report, you just talked about, we should really lean into supporting the people who are most directly affected by the loss of employment. A, because it's the decent thing to do, and B, because we're never going to get the broad-based acceptance of the overall path unless we've got those supports in place. The other lens is the macro top-down view of that, and I'd say two things. Firstly, for a difficult couple of years, I was responsible for the training system in the New South Wales government. And that's an example of where there's a huge amount that you can do to make the supply side much more responsive and effective at allowing people to make those shifts, not just from one specific plant into the community, but in the broad-based transition we're going to see across the economy over the next 30 years, and that's not just driven by climate change. The other one is the demand side, which is it's all very well to worry about a relatively small slice of the Australian labour market. But if you don't have demand, if you don't have people driving commercial opportunities and building new businesses and creating new sources of economic growth, there's nowhere for any of those people to go. And so you have to think about the upside potential in the transition as well as the really long-term solution to those transition issues.
I would just make the argument that the transition is going to happen, commercial realities will drive it, but is this necessarily a transition where we just want to let the market rip? Or do we actually want to manage the social and the community implications of that transition on the way through to try and get some better social and more equitable social outcomes along the way as well? And part of that is definitely managing for impacted communities, and part of that is investing in long-term skills transformation, and part of it is also capitalising on the amazing skills and research base that we actually already have in Australia and some of our leading educational institutions, some of the universities who are already leading globally in terms of the work that they're producing, particularly in renewable energy technology, but also in terms of value adding for resources as well. So in that sense, yes, I definitely agree. It's the micro, it's the macro, but it's also the how do we manage our way through, because this transition will happen. It will be messy and expensive, particularly for communities, or we can capitalise and get the best outcomes that we want as a community as well as for our economy.
Thank you so much, Emma. I think in many ways you've just captured what we've tried to say in the paper. I couldn't be more grateful to our three panelists today. We have to end it there. So for the live audience on Zoom, thank you for joining us. It's been a great occasion for us to come together and celebrate this work and the contributions of our speakers. So thank you everyone on Zoom for joining us.